Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Kayla, and today we're going to be talking about everything I've read in July. There's timestamps below in case you want to skip to where the reviews start, but I am going to go over my stats and my DNFs first. In the month of July, I read 12 books, 5 of which were audiobooks, 7 were physical, obviously. And then my monthly average was 3.44, which is pretty low for me. Usually I'm closer to like 3.6, 3.7, but it was just an okay month. I've been calling it the month of meh just because there were a lot of okay reads and maybe a couple pretty good reads. As far as the genre breakdown, it was 4 sci-fi, 2 horror, 2 romance, 1 lit fic, 1 thriller, 1 mystery, and 1 manga, but the manga is cozy fantasy, to be specific. And then I DNF'd 4 books. 1 was an audiobook called In Stormy Weather that I got from Book of the Month. I DNF'd it 5% in, probably less than that actually. And then 3 were arcs that I got from NetGalley. They were The Roman Holiday Rule, Awake Awake, and Mostly Human Resources. Okay, so the first book I read this month, or listened to really, was the Dungeon Crawler Carl audiobook by Matt Dinniman. If you don't know what it's about, basically Carl one night has to go outside to like get his ex-girlfriend's cat out of a tree. And then because he's outside, he miraculously survives the apocalypse. But because he survives it, now he has to compete in this like multi-level dungeon reality TV show that is full of a bunch of things that is trying to like kill him, you know? And if he manages to get to the 18th level, he can survive, but no one really knows what's at the end of it because no one's ever gotten that far. I think it was super interesting. It was really entertaining. I can totally see why people would like it because it kind of felt like I was listening to just like either a reality TV show or an action-packed video game, a little bit of both. I will say it kind of reads like that tutorial part of a video game where they're trying to teach you like, oh, X is how you jump. And if you press this and that, it's a combo move and you can like move really fast. And here's how you switch point of views. Just a lot of tutorial like talk. So pretty much world building, I guess. But I didn't find it off-putting because I'm used to that. I do think if you've never really experienced playing a video game, you'd kind of wonder like, why is it telling me all of this, you know? But because it's RPG or role-playing game, like it's RPG fic, it makes sense. That being said, I do think there are some things that could be really off-putting for others. I thought the humor was too much. I didn't even really think it was funny. There are a lot of crude sex jokes, just to be very blunt about it. And at first, I could kind of just ignore them, but there was this one moment near the end, after something quite devastating almost had happened, the cat makes like another crude joke, and it pulled me out of the book so bad that I remember I paused the audiobook and went, do I DNF it? But Audible has already taken my money, so I just decided to finish it. And I think it ends on a good note, but that really was too much. I will say, because I did read the second book, like, you know, as a spoiler, I read it this month, or I listened to it. It does get better, but that was way too much for me personally. And I also think that there are some moments where Carl faces kind of atrocities or just things that feel really horrifying, and he just like moves on very fast. And I understand that he has to, but I think that lack of humanity being displayed, like there was just no humanity being displayed, it felt a little off-putting. Like I said earlier, I did ultimately decide to continue the series because I'm not new to the first installment of something being very off-putting. For example, I love Black Mirror. Every single person I recommend Black Mirror to, I tell them to skip the first episode because if you base your entire opinion of that show on the first episode, you're not going to watch Black Mirror. It's too much in my opinion. So I decided to kind of give this a chance and continue on. Like I said, I did decide to continue the series. So the next audiobook was Carl's Doomsday Scenario, which encompasses the 3rd floor because the first book was the first 2 floors. And in this one, we get introduced to other little things the dungeon can have. One big thing was that they get to pick their classes. And that was stuff like, oh, do you want to go down the magician path or like the brawler path or like, you know, different pathways that you can take as you go through the dungeon. And then another big thing was quests, which in a video game, when you get like these little side quests, you can ignore them. In this, you don't always have a choice as to whether or not you get to just say no to it. Like sometimes you can say no and you still get pulled into it anyways because there's higher powers at work that are going to force you to be a part of it. And I think this was a much better improvement from the first book. It really found its feet. There were significantly less crude jokes, which I appreciated a lot because, as I said, I really didn't care for it in the first book. And I think it did a really good job at kind of showing these moments where Carl is genuinely a human and he like feels the impact of this really like messed up situation that he's in. I think the phrase that he uses to ground himself is a little corny, you know, like he'll go, "You will not break me." And it just felt so like So man. But then I think about the phrases I use to ground myself. Like when I'm dealing with stuff, I go, I can only do my best. And that's also very cringy, you know? So I didn't harp on it too much, but I will say the series as a whole, it's really entertaining. It listens like reality TV, right? It's just like action-packed entertainment, a little bit of humanity and vulnerableness, and then like they're also laying the groundwork for the future books. There's a lot of like political, not intrigue, but like background and setup, so you can see like how there's some dissent underneath everything. And while the dungeon crawlers don't really have any power, not everything is like perfect with like the Borant Corporation, the people who are running this season of the dungeon. But I would say overall, I did like this a lot more, and I'm actually really interested to see like what the third book has and how it kind of like improves upon the second book. So I think if you found the first book maybe a little too off-putting, I would say give the second book a chance and see how you feel, because the writing did improve and it did get better. I would say if anything, maybe the first book is just like the weakest in the series, but I haven't read the rest of the series to know that yet. Then we have This Story Might Save Your Life by Tiffany Crum. I did the audiobook for all of this, but I did get the book from Book of the Month before I ended up getting the audiobook, because I found out that the audiobook has additional content. If you get the audiobook, they give you an additional like clip of the actual podcast of the two characters. This is about Benny and Joy, who host a podcast called This Story Might Save Your Life. And it's just based on real people's interesting situations and how you might survive them. So they might do something like, oh, this person got eaten by a whale. What would you do if you were swallowed by a whale? Not eaten, you know? And it's really popular. And then one day, Joy disappears and the prime suspect is Benny, the co-host. When I picked this up, I thought I was going to be getting a thriller novel, because everywhere I see this reviewed is like a thriller subreddit or like in the thriller category. This is a romance with a mystery subplot. If you go into it expecting that, you may like it. But as somebody who was reading it as a thriller, that is kind of what I'm reviewing this as, and that has impacted my experience. As far as the romance goes, I didn't care for it because I found Benny and Joy to be very insufferable. I would describe this as idiots to lovers if I were to give it like an actual trope. It's like two of the most annoying people you know who very clearly like each other, but got in their own way and are making it everybody else's problem. And then all of a sudden it also turns into this kind of like domestic drama. And I just found I was so uninterested because I wanted to get to what was being talked about right here. But there was so much stuff going on that wasn't this. And I was so aggravated at one point. Once the mystery kind of starts to develop, it does get a little more interesting, but because it's told in dual POV, sometimes the chapters would continue with one person's POV for a little longer, which I do appreciate, but sometimes it would just like switch over to another person's. You know, it would switch from Benny to Joy's or Joy's to Benny's, and I would have rather it continued because switching over just kind of killed the momentum for me. And on top of that, we get the answer to where Joy is like pretty early on in the book, like around the halfway mark. And then what we have to do is watch all of the other characters kind of catch up to where we are. And when that happens, it's like there's no real excitement or intrigue that you typically could get in a mystery, so I just wasn't as interested in the plot. And then the solution to the mystery was pretty much a deus ex machina, I think that's how you pronounce it, where it was just this kind of like non sequitur thing that solved it. And I was like, okay, I mean, sure. It just wasn't the story I was promised. And then the story that I was given wasn't interesting enough for me to have wanted to have read this, you know? Next was Homesick by Rhiannon Grist. This is a horror novel, a very slow burn horror about a girl named Tamsin who runs away from life in the city to go live in a countryside village because of something that she's done in her past that has caused her to leave. But then when she's there, she meets her neighbor who is just a little too unsettling and looks a little too familiar. Now, for this book, if you don't like slow burn, this is not for you. And when I say slow burn, I mean slow burn horror. There is no romance in the story. You have to like a horror that takes its time to build, because this one, it spends so much time kind of like setting the scene and like leading up to things, and you don't really dive into anything that's super fast paced until the last 30% of the book, where like, you know, it really kicks in gear. And I would say a lot of this is almost a character study, so it feels more literary horror than just like pure horror. And I can say with certainty that Tamsin is probably one of the most unlikable MCs I've ever experienced in my life. This is told in a stream of consciousness style narration, so you spend so much time inside of Tamsin's head that you get to know her really well. and she's just very insufferable and deeply unlikable. She makes really quick snap judgments about everybody. Some people, I think they deserve to not see any kindness from her, but sometimes people are like genuinely showing her kindness and she's like misconstruing it as like this negative thing. And you know, once or twice is okay, but it's like she does this with everyone. She just assumes that everybody is like out to get her in some way, or that everybody is judging her and is an awful person. And it got to a point where I was just so sick of being inside of her head that I wanted the bad guys to win, you know? Like I was like, oh my God, can the bad guys win and put me out of my misery? And I don't think I would have finished this if it wasn't an arc. I probably would have DNF'd it at some point. But I will say, I think the last 30% kind of makes up for it. But I also think the solution to like the central conflict that we see Tamsin face in the last 30%, it's resolved in the most nonsensical way possible, in my opinion. Like, it's just, when she solves it, I remember looking at it and going, that's it? And then, funnily enough, the ending is just as ridiculous. Like, I don't think it's a bad ending. It's just very neat. Like, it's very much and they lived happily ever after. And I'm not used to horror stories having happily ever after endings. I'm not saying they can't, but I don't think it really made sense for this story. I was like, sure. And that's kind of how I felt once I put it down. I was like, okay, like it was fine. It wasn't amazing, but it wasn't really like bad either. It was just kind of okay. And I could see someone liking this if they like a good slow burn Scottish horror, because there's a lot of Scottish folklore that's involved in this. But ultimately, it just wasn't really the book for me. I'm telling you guys, like this was just like a meh month for me. So next is Mudlark by Mary Helen Speck, and it's about this girl Neko and her search for her mother Jenny. So basically, when it starts out, we see Jenny is performing with her band at Burning Man, and when she gets off stage, her daughter Neko, who she brought to Burning Man, is missing, and she can't find her. And then it cuts to about 25 years later, where Neko is now 38 years old, and she lives in a post-apocalypse or like post-dystopian world, New York. And she's with her little ragtag crew. And one day she finds her mother's like old, I believe masters would be the word for it. And she realizes that someone else is searching for it who could be her mother. So she goes on this quest to kind of try and find her. And I think this was an interesting story. It just wasn't really for me. It's written really beautifully, by the way. It's written in a way that I say would remind me more of spoken word or even almost poetry rather than like a novel. And I did like that. But I think what really weakened the story for me is the fact that it's told from dual point of view, and I didn't care for one of the point of views. So it's told from the point of view of Neko in like present time, but sometimes it does flash back to the past, and then her mother Jenny, as we're seeing her like struggles with motherhood and just like her relationships and just a lot of interpersonal drama. And ultimately, the part that just didn't really do it for me was Jenny's point of view. I'm not super interested in stories about like the struggles of motherhood, probably because I don't really want kids. I'm not really that interested in motherhood. So sometimes I would just like read her chapters and I'm like, I don't really care. And that would always feel mean, but it was just the truth. Like I just didn't really care about like reading about her struggles. And I think this could work for somebody else, but ultimately it just wasn't the story for me. I don't really have much else to say because it was just like such a middle of the road book that I barely remember. Like I remember what it's about, but I don't really have anything else I could tell you guys. Like I would say read it if you like a more literary dystopian novel. I've seen comparisons to Station 11. I haven't read that one yet, so I can't say. If you like really nice writing, then it might still be worth a read. It just wasn't really my kind of book. Next is Nothing Tastes as Good by Luc Dumas. This is a book about a man named Emmett Truesdale who's very overweight and wants nothing more than to be slimmer, to be his true self, which is like, a play on his name, Emmett Truesdale. And one day he actually gets selected for a clinical trial of this drug called Emaciate or Emaciate. And I think it's meant to be like, a parody of some sort of the GLP-1 drug. And it works. He's eating even more than he was when he wasn't on the drug, but he's still dropping weight. However, one thing he notices is that he's having these kind of gaps in his memory where he can't remember something, and it kind of lines up with people, dying and being eaten. So this is like, a good old-fashioned, cannibal novel. This is technically marketed as a horror. I would call this a literary thriller. A lot of it is spent on like character work with Emmett, where we're just kind of seeing inside his head and how he thinks. And I think one thing this book does really well is just kind of showing you how debilitating disordered eating and like disordered thoughts can be, because Emmett really doesn't like himself. He doesn't like that he's big, and he always has these beliefs that once he loses weight, everything will be better. Has this like underlying theme of, if you don't do any internal work on these issues that you have, losing weight does not do anything. You are just as unhappy as you were before, but you're in like a slimmer body. And I also think it does a really good job of just kind of depicting like how upsetting and how like hard it is sometimes to just be bigger in the world, you know. Like there are situations he has, like where he goes to a job interview and he's being discriminated against because he's bigger, or like just like people making quick judgments about his character, who he is, just because he's fat. And a lot of this was so on the nose and personal that, as somebody who has struggled with these kind of things before, I had to put the book down sometimes, because I was like, oh, this is hitting just a little too close to home for me, you know. And I think that is like probably my favorite aspect of this book. As far as like the thriller, I would say it's fine. It's not like really, it doesn't feel as important to the story almost. Like I feel like the character work that I was talking about, that's the really important part to the story. The other part, the thriller, is just kind of there to push the story along so that it has somewhere to go, you know, as we're kind of figuring out what's happening to all these people. It's just not as interesting or even as important. There is a plot twist. I would say, as far as expectation, I really wasn't anticipating it, because I kind of was operating under the assumption that this was a horror novel. So when it kind of had this thriller twist and I realized that it's more of a thriller, I was like, oh, okay. Like there was no way I really could have thought about that, because I wasn't really looking for anything. Maybe if you go in knowing this is a thriller, you'll predict it. I just wasn't looking for it, so I couldn't. But I think this was super interesting, and honestly, when I finished it, I think one of my biggest thoughts was, so the real villain is the American pharmaceutical industry, which I think I'm right in that statement. Next is A Fate Worse Than Drowning by Sarah Hawthorne. This is a gothic fantasy novel about two sisters, Elle and Linny, who live in this isolated lighthouse after Elle makes a deal with the devil to save her sister Linny from a fate that she thinks would be like very unhappy for her. And as a result, Elle has to lead sailors to their doom instead of like safety. She doesn't have to do it with every single boat she sees, but enough that like the devil is satisfied. And as they're living there, she's kind of trying to figure out what she can and can't do, but then something happens that causes her to need to make a second deal, and the devil goes, okay, here's what we're gonna do. The next non-kin individual that comes on this island, you have to kill before I see you again. And Elle is thinking, okay, well, non-kin means not my sister. That's easy enough, so I can do it. But then the next person that comes onto this island is actually somebody that her sister adores. So it turns into this real kind of like Faustian bargain, where it's like, be careful what you ask from the devil, you know? But then on the other side, we also have Linny, who is pretty naive and has been very sheltered. Elle has also been sheltered, but in a different way. Like Linny had asthma, so she was kind of kept out of society because her parents felt that was a bit of an embarrassment. So she just hasn't experienced even as much life as Elle. So she's pretty naive at first, and we kind of watch her grow into herself and also realize that perhaps her sister isn't the person she thought she was, because she has no clue about like anything that her sister has done to get her to this lighthouse. I really enjoyed the story, but it definitely took a while and a little bit more reflection for me to realize how much I liked it. I think if you're after this story for the fantasy, you may not care for it as much, because when I think about the magic system that's going on, I could not pin down specifically how anything works, because it didn't really explain it that well. But I think where it really shines is Elle, the sister who makes the deal. Like just her characterization and her insight and kind of the way she's dealing with all of this, I thought it was so interesting to read about. And I think she is a really good example of a rather irredeemable main character, because she does really bad things. And there are times where like, maybe she's given the chance to do better, or to want better, or to just like not do the wrong thing, but she's so certain and determined to be damned, because she's like, what is it, you know, like what situation am I in already, like what's one more atrocity, like, you know, atrocity, that you kind of stop expecting her to do good things. And then by the time you get to the end, you kind of get this revelation about the situation the girls are in that makes you go, oh, Elle is just a girl. You know, like genuinely, like she's just a girl who was misled. And I actually felt bad for her, which is funny because she's kind of an unpitiable character, because she's not meant to be that likable. But when you think about the situation she ends up in, you do feel bad for her and you almost want her to have a happy ending. But because she's kind of gone too far, you also know, or you understand that that's not really possible. So the ending is so bittersweet, and I haven't felt that empty from finishing a book in a while. Like, I remember I finished it and I just went, oh, I didn't think it was going to be so sad. Like, I expected at least like maybe a bittersweet ending. I was just like, I felt empty and blank, you know, which to me is usually the sign of a pretty well done Gothic novel, because I find most of them leave me in some state of like emptiness. So I think that's one thing the novel did really well. I think there's also a lot of really good imagery, because this is a coastal Gothic, so there's a lot of like water imagery and just like descriptions of like the area around them that I think I really appreciated. And I think there's a lot of melodrama around the sisters' relationship with one another, because they love each other, but it's very complicated when you two are the only people who can talk to each other. And when one sister would really like to have more freedom and the other one is determined to not let her have it. So it's kind of this slightly toxic relationship with each other that you see develop a little more as Linny comes into herself. That being said, I will say this is another case where I think the dual point of view really did kind of hurt the story. I would have preferred if the story was just from Elle's point of view from start to finish. I did see a review where someone said they would have preferred Linny's. I just really didn't care for it, because her story is more of a coming of age, like, you know, stepping out of naivety into freedom kind of aspect that I just wasn't a fan of. And because a lot of it is her finding out stuff about Elle that we are already made privy to as readers. So I don't really want to read about her catching up. Like, that's just kind of a thing with me. Like, if you give me the information, I don't really want to spend too much time on watching another character catch up to it, unless like that's the whole point of the story. And I guess it kind of is here, but I'm just not the biggest fan of that kind of storytelling, I suppose. The middle aspect of the story, like the middle section of the story, is a bit too boring, even for me, because I love a good, like, bleak, boring, you know, kind of nothing story. But the beginning is really interesting. And the end, when the plot takes center, is also really interesting. But the middle is almost a little too much character work. And I don't mind that, again, but because I don't really like Linny's character, it just started to grate on me. And I also felt that there just wasn't enough happening to keep me as engaged as I would have liked to. I got this as an ARC from NetGalley. It's coming out August 4th. I'm filming this the day before that. I don't know when this is going to be published. I do want to buy the book myself, though. Like, I really like it. I kind of went back and forth on whether or not I wanted to buy it, because the ending was so, like, depressing to me that I wasn't sure I wanted to put myself through that again. But then I remembered that I actually do like a good depressing story, and I do like a good, you know, story that can move me to that kind of level of like just feeling nothing and feeling empty and having so much to talk about, like what I'm talking with you guys about right now. So I am going to buy my own copy eventually. Next is The Honjin Murders by Seishi Yokomizo. This is the first book in the Kendaichi Kosuke series. And this is about like a pretty well-off, you know, like illustrious family, not illustrious, but like, you know, like higher class family, where the oldest son is getting married to someone who's a little bit below his station as far as the rest of the family is concerned. And then on the night of their wedding, after everything's said and done, a couple hours later, they hear like a scream in the night and the sound of this like instrument. And then when they go to the room, they find the couple is dead. And they don't know who could have done it, because they were the only two who were in the room. So they get this amateur detective, Kendaichi Kosuke, to help. I thought this was interesting. It was pretty fun. There's like a character list in the front, but if you don't pay attention to that or don't flip back to it, you'll be okay, because I was, and I never really looked at it again. And there's also this little, you know, crime scene map with like the evidence, just to kind of help you get a little bit more involved. And I do think it was fun to try and figure out where it was going to go and like who did it and make your own guesses, you know? But ultimately the solution was just too out there. It's really similar to Strange Houses by Uketsu in that sense, where I'm listening and I'm hearing the theory of how it went on, and I go, okay, sure, except in this case, it's not the theory, it's like how it happened, and I'm just like, this is the most out there thing. I actually don't know how you could have deduced this, but I think even with that in mind, it was still fun to read, and I have read the 8th book already, so I know that the writing gets better, and like the mysteries get more interesting, and they actually kind of build upon things that make more sense compared to this book. So I do plan to read the next one, which I think is called like the Inugami Curse. Next, I read There Is No Antimemetics Division by QNTM, and this is a sci-fi speculative horror about self-censoring entities and like an organization that exists to get rid of them. So this probably has the most interesting first chapter ever. The first line is like very nondescript and like very, you know, tame, But by the end of that chapter, the stakes jump pretty high, and I find it's a pretty fast-paced story throughout, although there are some chapters that are just like deeply slow to me. Like I just found I was like, oh, I don't really care. And you just kind of go through this book learning about the different kind of anti-memes. And the best way to describe an anti-meme would be something that by its nature of existing wants you to forget it exists or wants you to not share its existence. I think the example that the front cover uses is your password. Like your password exists, but you're not going to share it with others, right? So your password is technically an anti-meme. But in this case, it's like a monster that exists that follows you around, but you don't realize it's there. Or even when you know it's there, it makes sure that you cannot remember. If you try and like draw a picture of it, the picture ends up blurry. If you try and write a note about it, the note doesn't make sense. Like just from existing, you can't share anything about it. And it's very speculative and really interesting. And I found like the first half of this was so cool. And it was also so scary just in the concept of like, how do you fight a war against something you can't remember exists? I think someone even in the book even says that, and it was so cool. But then somewhere along the way, probably like the last third of this book, it turns into this like save the world kind of plot. And I think that could have worked, but when it does that and it kind of like leans into like a cosmic horror theme as well, the story starts to feel really shaky, and then it's building on top of this already shaky premise to where I get to the end and my only thought was, sure, whatever. And I don't think that that is a statement you should ever make about a book that is tagged sci-fi, unless it's like a hard sci-fi and you're reading like the explanations of like quantum physics and you're like, okay, yeah, okay. But like, that's not what this is. This is like a cosmic horror sci-fi. So I should at least kind of understand, but because nothing was really making sense and they kept building upon these nonsensical statements, I was so confused. And I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna vibe and I'm just gonna finish the story and kind of understand what's going on. I still enjoyed it, but I just think if it had just like stopped and not done that in the last third, this probably would have been a really easy 5-star, but that last part just kind of like sucked all the wind and the momentum out of the story for me. But I still think this is really cool. This is like one of the most speculative novels I've read all year, and I think like if you like the sound of it, you should still read it. Like it was fun. This is based on something called SCP. I have no exposure to that, and I do think that part of the reason that the last third was a bit too confusing is because it kind of is based on the SCP stuff. So if you don't have that information, it makes it a little harder to understand like what is going on in the story, like near the end. Next is Hat Atelier by Kamome Shirahama. And this was so cute. This is about a girl named Coco who wants more than anything to be able to use magic. And one day she does a spell that goes horribly wrong, and it ends up kind of turning her mom into like stone. And in order to figure out how to undo it, she has to now become an apprentice under Queefrey, a magician. And I thought it was just like the cutest little story ever, you know? The art was really well done. I think Coco's character is like that perfect, really excitable kid. There was this scene with one of the students under Queefrey where I was like, am I gonna have to deal with this whole like plot line about people being bigots? But no, it's just like a really gifted kid kind of being a brat. And I was like, okay, yeah, whatever, I'm used to that. But I thought it was just like the perfect cozy fantasy story. It's, again, really introductory, where it's just kind of like explaining stuff and you're seeing like some basic things like, this is how we use magic, and this is how we write out our spells, and these are some of the things we do, and these are the bad guys. But I thought it was really well done, and I definitely plan to continue the series. Next is Whistler by Ann Patchett. I did this like part audiobook, part, physical book. I will say if you do the audiobook, it's narrated by the author, Ann Patchett. However, she speaks naturally in 0.5x speed, so you will want to speed it up. I usually do 1.5x. I had to do like 2 to 2.5 to get it into like the speed that I like. This is about a girl named Daphne Fuller who's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York with her husband one day, and they notice an older man is following them. And when they go and confront him, she realizes it's Eddie Triplett, a man who was married to her mother for a year when she was 9, and she hasn't seen for decades since, because now she's like 53 years old. And they connect and they act as though they've never been apart. And it just kind of turns into this story of like memory and relationships, and how even the really small and brief relationships you have with others can be really impactful. This is my second Patchett book. I read The Dutch House in June and I adored it. And I think one thing she does really well is keeping her writing so like gentle and subtle that you don't always realize what the point is until you get to a specific scene, and it kind of just like hits you like a flash and you're like, oh, that's the point. And I think this does that really well as well, because at first it's a lot of reminiscing on the past, and there's also scenes about the specific event that kind of led to Eddie Triplet and Daphne Fuller's mother divorcing. But at some point you realize that the whole point of this story is pretty much just about like memory and how memory can change and be altered as time goes on, but also just how someone can be in your life for like a really brief moment but still impact you decades later in ways that you don't even always realize, because again, she hasn't seen Eddie in decades, and it isn't until they meet again that she's like, I don't know why I haven't thought of you in so long, and you know, you were so impactful to me, and I'd never really thought about that. And I think that is something that she does, that Pashette does just beautifully. Like, she's really good at stories about like just human relationships and like these aspects of humanity that you don't always think about. I think I ended up giving this a 4 because as good as I thought the story was, I felt it was just a bit too saccharine, if I had to give it a word. I saw a review that said this was twee, and I do kind of agree with that. The best way for me to describe it would be that it feels like this book is trying to give me a hug, but I can't really figure out why it thinks I need a hug. I think if you want a really good, comforting book with no tension, and I really mean no tension, there's not a single real conflict in this book, in my opinion, but there is like a deeper message. It's still like a really effective lit fic book, you know? But if you want something just like very comforting and that you could just like read and end and feel kind of warm all over, I think it would be really good for that. Next is Obstetrix by Naomi Kritzer. This is a novella about a woman who is acquitted for performing the last abortion in North Dakota. And after she's found not guilty, she decides to just try her luck somewhere else because she doesn't really want to work in North Dakota anymore, when she is kidnapped by a fundamentalist cult who needs an OBGYN because their last one is no longer with them. So this was a pretty quick story, and I do think it's a pretty like standard thriller. It was fine. I would say it's tagged as sci-fi and horror. I mean, I think fundamentalist cults sound terrifying and, you know, a little scary, but I wouldn't call this sci-fi or horror, honestly. It's really just a thriller. And as far as thrillers go, it's okay. There's no real twist if you're looking for that in a thriller, and I think the story itself isn't actually that surprising. As I was reading it, I never once doubted that everything would work out and would be okay, because there's just nothing done to make you think otherwise. Like, it doesn't really subvert any expectations. It's just like a very like basic and simple story. And I think if you want something that would be maybe a palate cleanser is the right word, just something to read in between other books, this would be worth it. And it's very fast, but if you're looking for like a sci-fi or a horror, there isn't much else to say. There are definitely some moments that made me like a little angry, just like the way they kind of talk about things, about like people's expectations of what they expect from like men and women, you know. But that just kind of comes with reading about a fundamentalist cult, you know, like what are they called, like fundies. Like it just aggravated me. And finally, I ended the month off reading Phoebe Berman's Gonna Lose It by Brooke Averick. What I like to do whenever I have a month that I feel was just kind of okay is end it with a romance that has a pretty good premise. Because while I'm not the biggest romance fan, I find that the right romance can really save a month for me, and this did exactly that. So this is about a girl named Phoebe Berman who's about to turn 30 in a month, and she doesn't want to be 30 years old and still a virgin, so she and her friends make like this list of things she can do, and hopefully by the time she ticks off everything, she just won't be a virgin in the next month. And she has 3 possible candidates. The first one is this new teacher who's kind of like really dreamy and works at the elementary school that she also teaches at. The next one is this guy that she plays Wordle with like every day, and they talk all the time, and they're from the same city of like Boston, I believe. And the third person is her roommate, who feels like, you know, the start of like a little friends to lovers story. And I thought this was just like so fun. I wouldn't say like this is the best written book ever. I do think some of the characters felt a little one-dimensional, but this was so fun. And there were a lot of moments that I just started laughing at, because it was just, I don't know, like I think Phoebe's experience just feels very human at times. And there were some moments where I was like, I don't know if this is what a 30-year-old acts like, but I'm also not 30, so I can't speak on it, you know? Like, it felt a little juvenile, but like, you're still young at 30 years old. And I just think like her experience as well with anxiety and just kind of like getting nervous around people was something that I think is pretty relatable. Also, there's no like third act conflict in this, not in the way you think. It's kind of like a subverted thing where instead of the standard third act conflict, something happens that like takes everything I thought I knew about the book I was reading. It just like spun it on its head, and I was like, oh my goodness. And once you read it and you really think about what you read, I felt like she'd been breadcrumbing it the entire time, and I just didn't notice. Because, you know, you have like these expectations going into a romance, so you don't anticipate that. But it just made the story feel a little bit more like complex and human, where you realize like, you know, everyone's just trying to figure out what's going on in their life, and everyone's struggling in their own ways, and everyone thinks the grass is greener on the other side. So I really appreciated that. This was just a really fun, cute little rom-com, and I think I'd probably compare it to Bridget Jones' Diary, the movie. I watched that like over a decade ago, so please don't take my word for it, but like I think it could be compared to that as far as like the feelings it inspired, and I think it was the right mix of romantic, a little funny, and sappy. So I was really happy to end my month with this book. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you made it to the end of the video, let me know what your favorite or least favorite book was in July. If you didn't read anything in July, let me know if you plan on seeing that Wicker Man movie. I am going to go see it. I know that much. If you liked this video, subscribe, leave a like, and I'll talk to you guys next time.